It is our great pleasure to host a little seminar for Dr. Benn Steil and James Nolt. And they are really distinguished opinion leaders in the U.S. That is why I think our Ministry of Foreign Affairs invited them. I know they had a very, very hectic schedule today. I was told that they had 8 meetings today. and this is last one. I hope but they look great. I don't think I cannot believe that they arrived here last night. And also, as you know, Dr. Benn Steil is a really renowned economist in the U.S. He's known as Mr. Bretton Woods. He recently completed a book on Bretton Woods history. You are trained as an economic historian?
No, I just play one. No, I'm trained as a pure economist.
He's a senior fellow on Council on Foreign Relations and director of International Economics. It is very rare for us to have such a very distinguished person. Another person is Dr. James Nolt, and apparently I have known him since his graduate student days here in Chicago. And in fact, I read his very interesting article in International Studies Quarterly. And since then, when I get to the names that he's Nolt, so I checked it, and apparently he had a Chicago affiliation. Therefore, I thought he's the right person. And he insisted his specialty is political economy, and then that thing Nolt must be right. James Nolt must be right person. Anyhow, we'll do it this way. Dr. Steil gave about 15 minutes brief talks, very fine, really emerging economists in the Fed, and also Jim Nolt will be talking about Trump policy. And he wrote this very interesting blog about why Trump would attack North Korea, why he would war on the Korean Peninsula. He gave 4 reasons why, and I hope that he would elaborate on those 4 reasons.
And we hope he's wrong.
Yes, I hope I'm wrong too.
We are hoping we are wrong, but his analysis is very compelling and persuasive. Therefore,
yeah, too compelling. I hope it's not.
I hope you're wrong.
Yeah.
But with this brief background, let us start. Ben, would you start first?
Thank you, Professor Moon.
Yes.
For having us here. We're grateful to you all. Given that we've got a new administration in Washington that is pledged to implement some pretty radical changes in both domestic and foreign economic policy, together with a Federal Reserve that's increasingly hawkish in their approach to monetary policy, I think there are some significant prospects for massive capital outflows from emerging markets. So I thought it would be a good idea to focus my introductory comments on some fissures in the international monetary system that I think will be of relevance to emerging markets and in particular to Korea in the coming years. In terms of the geopolitical impact of these sorts of big changes in policy, I think the most interesting case study is a country that's been in the news for rather different reasons, but Ukraine. Back in April 2013, the Yanukovych government in Ukraine walked out of negotiations with the IMF over a $15 billion financial assistance package. The issue, as it always was elimination of energy subsidies that the Yanukovych government thought were politically unpalatable. They decided instead to muddle through by borrowing in the international bond markets. They successfully issued a $1.25 billion 10-year euro bond at a 7.5% interest rate. Everything was going swimmingly until 1 month later, on May 22nd, then Fed Chairman Benn made his now infamous taper comments. These remarks were actually very carefully hedged. He said that the Federal Reserve might, in the coming months, if market conditions so warranted, begin to pare back its monthly asset purchases. And this caused cataclysms in emerging market currency and bond markets. And as you can see from the first page of my handout, you'll have that here. The country that was hardest hit by Ben Bernanke's comments was Ukraine. The yield on these 10-year bonds soared from 7.5% to over 11.5%. On this particular chart, I've got the data for 7-year government bonds. There was more Bloomberg data on that. But it stayed at this level throughout most of the rest of the year. And at that level, the Ukrainian government was no longer able to roll over its debt month to month. And in December, they were forced to abandon an association agreement with the European Union and accept a bailout offer from Russia. And as they say, the rest is history. You can see what happens in December when Russia offers the bailout deal. Bond yields plummet, and Ukraine looks like it could potentially be solvent again. But of course, Ukrainians take to the street. Yanukovych was deposed, and the rest is history. The interesting footnote about this is that the Federal Reserve didn't actually begin its taper until January 2014, a point at which the markets were much calmer and took it in stride. And so my argument would be if Ben Bernanke had, at least with hindsight, had kept his mouth shut and had not said anything until January of 2014, Yanukovych could still be in power today. And we'd have a totally different geopolitical position in the region. And I'm not saying this in order to put all the burden of the Ukrainian crisis on poor Ben Bernanke, but just to illustrate how sensitive the international monetary system is to just the prospect of some modest changes in monetary policy in the United States. Now, if you go to my next chart, you'll see, of course, it wasn't just Ukraine that was hit. The bond markets and currency markets of an enormous number of emerging markets were hit. But the important point I want to emphasize is that it was not a random reaction in emerging markets. If you look at the big figure that I have here, what I did was plot current account balances in major emerging markets against the percentage change in currency valuation against the dollar in the months following Ben Bernanke's taper comments. And what you find is a huge correlation, that it was those countries with the largest current account deficits. These were countries that were dependent on the short-term importation of dollar capital, which was being facilitated by the Fed's monthly asset purchases. It was these countries that were the hardest hit. And emerging markets with current account surpluses, in particular, you'll see in the upper left-hand corner, South Korea was not hit at all. In fact, the South Korean won actually strengthened over that period. And this is the point I'm going to come back to momentarily, because I think it's an important one. Now, a lot of policymakers, particularly in emerging markets at the time, pointed to this episode and argued that we really needed some deep changes in policy to make sure that things like this did not happen again, because they were causing catastrophes in some emerging market countries. Now, I want to go piece by piece into what sort of changes had been recommended and how they played out. The governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Raghurajan, for example, argued that the responsibility was on the Fed to coordinate changes with other central banks around the world much better than they did. And I would argue, on the basis of evidence over that period, that that's a utopian idea. It's not going to happen. And the most significant evidence I would point to is some fascinating transcripts of a Federal Open Market Committee meeting in October of 2010, in which the FOMC is discussing currency swap lines with emerging markets. Now, one of the major innovations that the Fed introduced in the earliest part of the crisis was unlimited swap lines with developed economies, particularly in Europe, which was actually central to ensuring that the European banking system did not collapse, because of course the ECB could not provide European banks with dollar financing. It had ultimately to come from the Federal Reserve. But in October of 2010, the FOMC is discussing whether these should be extended to emerging markets. And the content of their discussion is fascinating. You see the FOMC almost unanimous in its view that the financial crisis is beginning to spread globally and they have to do something about it. But it's not because they're concerned about stopping the crisis from spreading to other countries. They're worried about the possible feedback effects into the United States. So they identify a small number of emerging markets that they believe could cause problems for the United States if they lack the ability to access dollar financing in an easier, another way to swap lines. And one of the FOMC members, the Vice Chairman Don Cohn, argued that there were a number of emerging market countries that had significant holdings of U.S. agency securities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in particular, and if they lacked access to dollar financing, they might dump those securities on the market, pushing up mortgage rates in the United States and deepening the recession in the United States. And the four countries they identified were Brazil, Mexico, Singapore, and South Korea. Now, it's fascinating that these countries, and only these countries, were extended swap lines for the simple reason that they could create problems for the United States. Not that the United States could create problems for them, but that they could feed back their problems into the United States. Within 3 years, as the crisis receded in the United States, even though it was getting worse in other countries, the Fed unilaterally canceled all of these swap lines with emerging markets. So my first argument would be, do not count on the Federal Reserve to prevent another Ukrainian geopolitical crisis from emerging again. It won't happen. The second possibility is that emerging markets themselves will implement reforms to stop this sort of thing from affecting them. And in this regard, I would point to a fascinating study done by the IMF that was published in the fall of 2013, in which they identified the key characteristics of the emerging markets that had weathered the storm of unconventional monetary policy in the United States best. And they said that these countries had three particular characteristics. One, they had large current account surpluses. Two, they had large US dollar foreign exchange reserves. And three, they had a low level of foreign ownership of domestic assets. Essentially, they were South Korea. Now, South Korea implemented reforms after the Asia financial crisis precisely to ensure that conditions like those would obtain. So Korea would never again have to go cap in hand to the US Treasury and the International Monetary Fund. And they were extremely successful in making sure that crisis conditions in international markets never fed back on them the way they did during the Asia financial crisis. The problem is that if you look at those three indicators, large current account surplus, large US dollar foreign exchange reserves, low level of foreign ownership of domestic assets, this is almost the definition that the US Congress has of currency manipulation. which is very much in the news today. So the point I want to emphasize is that if an emerging market does exactly what the IMF identified as being the key steps that they could take to prevent a financial crisis in their country, they will be the most likely target of currency manipulation charges by the US Congress. And this, to me, is the fundamental flaw in the dollar-based international financial architecture, that if countries do what's sensible to protect themselves, irrespective of any sort of protectionist aims, it will contribute to global imbalances, in particular to current account deficits in the United States, and produce a political blowback in the United States that eventually produces an anomalous president, we hope, Jim and I hope, like Donald Trump, who pledges to eliminate it. So number two, I don't put any stake, I don't put any credibility in this idea that emerging markets can deal with this problem by themselves. My last alternative, what if emerging markets bond together and produce a collective solution? This to me makes complete sense, because there's no logic to a country like South Korea having $400 billion in foreign exchange reserves just to protect itself from financial crisis, when the region itself is awash in US dollar foreign exchange reserves. And in fact, we already have a regional grouping, the so-called Chiang Mai Initiative, that Korea is part of, which in theory gives access for all the countries in the initiative to over $250 billion in foreign exchange reserves in the case of a crisis. Chiang Mai, you may remember, was implemented after the Asia financial crisis to try to ensure that countries in the region would not have to go to the IMF again in a crisis. So what has happened since then? Because plenty of countries have experienced crises. How much of this $250 billion of combined reserves have been tapped over the past 20 years? Zero. Nothing. The reason is that the likely creditors within Chiang Mai don't want this money ever to be called upon. So the rule that was put in place was that no country could ever draw on more than 30% of its quota without being on an IMF program. Now, in a crisis, you will almost invariably need well more than 30% of your quota, and if you have to be on an IMF program anyway, you might as well borrow the money from the IMF. There's no sense in going to Chiang Mai. So that's why the money has never been tapped. Now, there are other alternatives in the region, particularly China-led initiatives that are supposed to address these concerns as well. And you can take a look at this figure that I put together. The so-called BRICS Bank initiative. There is one feature of it called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, which is sort of like a Chiang Mai. It's a pooling of reserves. But it has the same sort of restrictions that Chiang Mai has, but they're even tighter. Brazil, Russia, and India, under the BRICS CRA rules, could only call on $5.4 billion worth of financing in a crisis without being on an IMF program. $5.4 billion in a foreign exchange crisis is nothing. And you would be literally insane to tap that money if you were getting into difficulty, because A, it would not stop the crisis from coming, B, it would accelerate the crisis by signaling to the markets that a crisis is coming and that you will have to go to the IMF. And to put it in historical perspective, if you go back 15 years to the last major Brazilian financial crisis, when capital flows were less than a tenth of what they are today, Brazil was granted access to over $30 billion in financing from the IMF. If you go back to the 1990s, when capital flows were much smaller still, Russia was given access to $38 billion and financing. So if you look at the bottom chart here, you'll see that all of these countries hold massive foreign exchange reserves because they would never have confidence in a system like that in a crisis. So the moral of my story is basically that as easy as it is to point out the deep fissures in the dollar-based international monetary system, it is equally difficult to improve on it given the political pressures that all the various constituents in the international monetary market face.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's get to Jim.
Thank you, and again, thanks to all for coming, and I'm pleased to be here. And Dr. Steil gave a very interesting talk. I want to focus a little bit more on the current administration in the United States and what the implications are for policy in this region. And of course, I have to make the disclaimer that I am not a government representative. My views are my own. They're not. But I do, one of the things we share is a concern that this current administration is a significant departure from any previous presidential administration, at least in the post-war period. One of the first things I'm going to look a little bit at foreign economic policy and then at security policy. In the era of foreign economic policy, Donald Trump and several of his key advisors are avowed economic nationalists. Now, this is not a new position. Trump has been an economic nationalist for decades now, and so have several of his key advisors, including Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro and Wilbur Ross and so forth. So there's a core group there that has a strong inclination toward economic nationalist solutions in trade and in monetary politics, as well as things like immigration and so forth. The question for me is, and for many observers, is whether this is something that they can and will implement, or whether it's been mostly rhetoric designed to win some political support, and which they'll jettison once they run into the economic or the political realities of ruling in Washington. We haven't got strong indications yet, other than the fact that of the attempted travel ban, which of course has failed twice, and some indication of tightening of immigration. So in that respect, Trump has demonstrated some degree of economic nationalism. Most of the other aspects of that program have yet to be implemented. Of course, he did cancel TPP as one of his first acts, but that was expected and may have happened under even if Hillary had been elected instead. But the really big steps that he had promised to take have not come yet. So what I'm concerned is to what extent will he try to implement an economic nationalist program, and or to what extent he will abandon it and just try to muddle through. I think either direction has serious implications for the Trump administration, because if he abandons a lot of the goals that he promised to his constituents and doesn't perform well economically, he's likely to be a one-term president. In fact, the Republican Party will have difficulties in the next election, 2018. He promised 4% growth. He promised a much more powerful economic nationalist program that's supposedly going to bring jobs and industry back to the United States. If he can't deliver on those things, it's going to be kind of obvious. He might just muddle through, and so far he hasn't tried to do any of the really big initiatives other than jettisoning TPP. But one of the dimensions of his economic nationalism is an emphasis on bilateralism rather than multilateralism in both trade and currency issues. And a lot of people notice the trade, but the currency gets shuffled under the rug. People don't notice as much what he said about currency. Of course, the two are related, because he believes that trading accounts should balance on a bilateral basis, something which virtually no economist would agree with. But the implication of that is also that currency negotiations also have to be on a bilateral basis. Well, in a system of freely traded currencies such as we have today, what that would essentially mean is that you'd be including in trade treaties specifications about central banking policy and perhaps systems of pegs or something like that. I don't know exactly how he intends to implement it, but clearly he wants to influence central banking policies of countries like China, for example, he's said a lot about, and probably South Korea, in a context of a bilateral trade negotiation as part of an overall deal, country to country. And of course, part of the argument for an economic nationalist for bilateralism is that a strong country like the United States, dealing one-on-one, is more likely to get what it wants rather than having to deal in a multilateral setting with many different countries where coalitions are possible and where smaller countries, with similar interests can group together. So the extent to which bilateralism will be the guiding principle, again, it's too early to see that in action. We haven't really seen a strong effort, although he has promised a kind of bilateral negotiation with Britain in the context of probable Brexit, to see if we can have some kind of sustaining of a close relationship with Britain. Most of the other bilateral relationships so far are theory rather than any practice, but I think we also have to consider how much implementing an economic nationalist program would run up against very powerful interests in the United States. Not just the political establishment of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, both of which he campaigned against, but also against the interests of a great number of powerful American corporations that have global supply chains, that don't want to see new taxes or new expenses imposed within their trading system, and would undoubtedly try a variety of means to subvert, evade, or counter any sustained effort to implement economic nationalist policy. So one of the first things that I considered, and I wrote a few blogs on it, is what are the powers of the president to implement economic nationalism if he's inclined to do that. And existing law gives him a certain range of powers, including, for example, using anti-dumping suits as part of the bilateral negotiation. We've already seen that over a period of years. This is a tactic that's sometimes been used, not because actual dumping occurs, but because by alleging dumping you can get countervailing tariffs and use that as a bargaining chip in other ways. And that doesn't require new legal authority. Another possibility is under the provisions which haven't been implemented yet of the currency, on the currency claims, that claims of currency manipulation, you can also use tariff remedies to punish countries that are designated as a currency manipulator. That power, again, hasn't been used yet, but the basis for it, the legislation is there. And if he chooses to declare currency manipulators, as you so eloquently expressed, in a way it's a kind of contradictory policy to the thrust of much of the sound economic advice that countries have gotten to how to avoid economic crisis, and yet by following sound economic advice now they're going to be punished potentially as currency manipulators and then suffer tariffs. What he can't do systematically is impose tariffs without congressional authorization. That is, he can't have a broad-based tariff program. There's sort of incremental ways that he can do it, to use different executive powers to bargain for specific bilateral trade adjustments, but it's hard to do that on a broad way without congressional authorization. One of the things they talk about now is a border adjustment tax, which is essentially a tariff in disguise, changing the tax treatment to favor exporters and punish importers, but of course the effect of it is very similar to a tariff. Things like that will, if he has to get congressional approval, that would be difficult because a bipartisan majority of Congress is pro-free trade and is backed by donors and constituents that I mentioned from powerful American corporations that are against any sort of interference or restriction of global trading. So I think it would be very hard legislatively to implement a consistent economic nationalist program. If he, as happened with the recent healthcare bill, if he tries to go in this direction and fails because he can't get congressional authorization, what he'll have is a string of failures. And knowing Donald Trump's personality, and his opposition to a lot of the political orthodoxy, he may not be satisfied with a string of failures. And so that sort of gets me to the second part of my talk, which is what possibilities are there, given his personality, given his economic nationalist inclinations, what possibilities are there for him to, in a sense, enhance his executive power and break out of the political bind that he may soon find himself in and not being able to implement a lot of the major initiatives that he wanted, and certainly not to get the kind of results that he promised to the electorate. Well, one area, of course, is if there's a war, any kind of significant war, executive powers are enhanced. And they're particularly enhanced by, for example, the Trading with the Enemy Act, which was passed way back in 1917 during World War I, which gives the executive very broad powers over trade. It hasn't been used much except during war. But there are a number of other ways in which a wartime situation would give the president enhanced executive powers. I won't go through all of them, but and also just to be able to stigmatize your opponents as being not merely political opponents, but traitors. In a wartime situation, it becomes much easier for you to demonize your opposition. I am not sure that Trump would take this route, but at the same time, I'm much less confident that he won't, as compared with all previous American administrations, who I think were genuinely interested in deterrence and avoiding wars for the most part. Trump, it's much less certain whether he's really going to deter in a situation where he might see considerable political advantages coming from war. So, and of course, he's also enhancing the military budget significantly while cutting most of the other federal spending in his recent budget proposal. So when I thought about this, and I thought, well, if Trump thought that war was a good political solution to him, where would a war most likely be advantageous? And so I thought about all the different scenarios. I won't run through all the logic of that. I have some of that in published blogs that I have up. But I looked at Iran, for example. There's a lot of problems there because, number one, the U.S. would have to occupy. It's a very big country. It's mountainous. We already had great trouble occupying Iraq, which is 1/3 of the population. Iraq itself would become ungovernable because most of the Iraqi Shiites are close to Iran. If you invade Iran, you have all kinds of problems again in Iraq and so forth. So, I mean, it's inconceivable that you could get a very politically attractive, and I use that in quotes, war in a situation like Iran, despite the fact that, of course, Trump has been very negative about Iran and identified Iran as a major enemy of the United States, and of course opposed the negotiated settlement of the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama had implemented. And situations like Syria also, the U.S. doesn't really want to occupy Syria. It's a very difficult situation. They're getting involved in a small way, but it doesn't affect much executive powers. On the other hand, when I look at the Korean situation, it's somewhat different because, first of all, North Korea is probably the most isolated country in the world with no effective allies. It has a very belligerent leadership, which is probably relatively easy to provoke and has already taken a number of violent steps, and so it would be plausible in any context of a crisis or an incident to label North Korea as the troublemaker, and it would actually be plausible. Another aspect of why I think the Korean situation, of course, is the rapid development of Korean missile technology and nuclear weapons, which makes it appear as a plausible threat to the United States itself. Donald Trump himself is on record as tweeting that North Korean ICBMs won't happen. He doesn't tell us why it won't happen, but considering that there's no indication the Trump administration puts a high stock in negotiations, and they've said all options are on the table, that includes military options, I have to imagine that they're thinking of some military solutions to that, which I'm going to get to briefly toward the end. Another aspect of the Korean situation is that the United States, of course, has a long-term alliance with South Korea. And unlike the situation in the Middle East, where if the U.S., for example, were to get into a war with Iran, we would be the main occupying power. If there's a war with North Korea, if North Korea collapses, obviously South Korea is the default occupying power. It wouldn't be a United States expense or problem. And so from the standpoint of a nationalist like Trump, it looks like a cleaner solution, a less problematic solution than one where the U.S. would have to directly create the regime, solve the problem in the aftermath. Now, in terms of the military situation, I myself am not so worried about North Korean ICBMs or nuclear, in part because North Korea can never be an autonomous nuclear power. It's too small a country. With a given technology, most people didn't talk about this during the Cold War, but it's much easier to intercept a missile during the boost phase than during the reentry phase. That was always known. I mean, the physics of it's very simple. That during reentry, all you've got left is a very small warhead, and it's moving very, very fast. It's much harder to intercept. That's why a lot of existing ABM technology has a high failure rate and a low reliability for interception. But it's always known that during the boost phase, when a missile's going up, it's first of all, it's got a big flame coming out. It's an easy infrared target. It's a big target, and it's moving much more slowly. So boost intercept has always been considered by far the easiest way to intercept a missile. The problem is we could never consider it with China or the Soviet Union because those are big countries and they can have the missile sites in the middle of the country. There was a time in the 60s the U.S. considered a space-based ABM system, but then we had a treaty with the Soviet Union outlying weapons in space, and so it was never implemented. But North Korea is different because it's a small country, and any missile launches are going to be within 100 or 200 kilometers of the coast. And the U.S. Navy, for those of you that don't know the technology, has a large number of Aegis-class cruisers and destroyers armed with the SM-3 missile, which has sufficient range to reach anywhere in North Korea at high speed and is designed to intercept missiles. So boost phase intercept of missiles is not a very difficult military problem, and the U.S. has very large numbers of systems, even disregarding THAAD. Now, of course, THAAD deployment to South Korea has been controversial. To me, it's a redundant system because we already have the capability. By stationing a few warships off each coast of North Korea, we already have the capability to intercept any missile launch with pretty high degree of reliability. That offers additional kind of redundancy to that capability, but it isn't really a new capability. The U.S. already has that capability, and so does Japan. Japan also has Aegis and SM-3. So sea-based ABM systems are much more plausible and effective in the case of a North Korean missile threat than they would be in many other cases. So given that, I think my own view is that we can be patient and try to develop a system of pressure and incentives to try to get a long-term negotiated solution to the problem. But I don't think that Trump will necessarily come to the same conclusion, because the other side of that is that missile interception also provides a possible way to take an armed action or a military action against North Korea without necessarily provoking a full-scale war. So, for example, what if the Trump administration, I've asked a couple of the people we met with today, I said, what if the Trump administration puts an Aegis cruiser off North Korea and says, okay, next missile launch, we're going to shoot it down. We don't know if the missile launched is a test or if it's targeted on us, so we're going to be safe, we're just going to shoot them all down. What would be the North Korean reaction? Now, I guess none of us in this room know. But I think that's a very plausible action because it doesn't look necessarily warlike. It looks like a relatively reasonable response to a threat. And yet, undoubtedly from North Korea, it's going to look like it's very provocative. I'm not sure that Trump will take such a step, but I think that kind of action, some action like that, because most people say, well, the alternative is negotiations or bombing facilities. Not necessarily. You could just say, missile launches, we're going to prohibit them. If you launch a missile and it gets out of North Korean airspace, we're going to shoot it down. I think it's quite possible that the Trump administration will take some more forceful step like that without concern to the possible escalation of the incident, because they're not so worried politically that war would be bad for them. They're not necessarily so concerned about deterrence as I think previous administrations would have been. They might veer on the side of being a little more reckless. So I'm not saying this is necessarily high probability, but analyzing both the military possibilities and the political difficulties that Trump's going to face, I can see that somebody like Steve Bannon and the president talking together may come up with something like this and think this sounds like a plausible and defensible solution to their problems. So I hate to end on that rather down note. I'll say one positive thing though. I mean, the other track that we see coming out of the Trump administration in terms of restraining North Korean missile development is to put more pressure on China. Personally, I'm rather skeptical that they're going to come up with enough pressure to make that deal happen. In other words, the U.S. to press China, to press Korea, to end nuclear weapons development. I think that's a very unlikely chain of pressure myself, but I think they might try. But the other side of that is if there is a real conflict in the Korean Peninsula, that would also be the best opportunity for Trump to implement an economic nationalist program, including sanctions against China, because then China could be designated as an enemy country. You know, even if we're not fighting China, which I wouldn't expect we would be, China could be designated as an enemy country, and thereby any kind of sanctions implemented against it, which would accomplish Trump's policy of trying to restrain Chinese imports into the United States and so forth. So I think that the U.S. role could change in ways that are not anticipated just looking at the precedent of past U.S. policy. This is a different administration. They have different calculations. And the political situation of the president is rather insecure. He may see the advantages of taking more forceful action as one solution to his political problem. So with that, I will end, and I'm sure I've put out a lot of provocative ideas that we can discuss. I look forward to that. Thank you.
Okay, Professor An, would you start? Don't make long comments in a short passage, okay? And so that we can, open the floor so that we can have more open discussions.
I don't think I can make a long comment without really reading, the full paper. Maybe my comment could be very much piecemeal. First of all, Dr. Steil, you mentioned that Korea, sort of the potential currency manipulator, and pointing out that the purging the Korean account, the surplus against the United States. But let me tell you this: the current ongoing account surplus is basically, very deep recession-induced. The current surplus, because of the slow growth. As a result, slow the import. Therefore, we are able to accumulate such a large trade surplus. And the other point, I want to make is that in the past 5 years or so, after the effectuation of the Korea's FTA, okay, Korea's foreign direct investment in the United States has been, maybe about 3 times the U.S. foreign direct investment into Korea. Okay, so to that extent, Korea really contributed a lot to create, employment opportunities. So, U.S. government all the time ignore, this crucial fact. You just look at the current bilateral, current account. To me, it doesn't make any sense. Okay. And I think we need to consider about this. And also, U.S. continue to demand the sharing the currency market, so you see, the operation. I mean, that's a fundamental right of any countries, okay, to smooth out, to avoid the volatility of the exchange rate. So to that extent, the Bank of Korea has been doing, that the currency sort of the operation to smooth out. So in that regard, just the dumping, Korea is putting Korea on a watch list on the currency manipulator is not really, I mean, to me, it's really rational, okay, given the three the factors. And second question, maybe now Korea is under serious economic crisis, including this security challenge and so forth. Now, U.S. Fed continue to raise interest rate. Okay, maybe sooner or later, U.S. interest might be greater than the South Korean interest rate. Then I can see that a great deal of excess of foreign exchange, as you mentioned, from Korea. Therefore, now Bank of Korea and the general Korean business sectors is very keen about how much, when, how soon, Fed raised the interest rate. Therefore, we are under very vulnerable situation. Therefore, if you brand Korea as currency manipulator, okay, that could be another great blow for Korea. And then third point I would like to make is that you mentioned that the importance of the bonding together in an emerging market as evident in the Chiang Mai initiative, okay? And so I think this, I recognize that we are rather limited capacity in terms of, they provide some substantial bailout package whenever the crisis. But nevertheless, I think the Korea, I agree with that. Try hard to enlarge the foreign exchange reserve under Chiang Mai initiative scheme, and then the East Asian economies undertake the early warning system and prompt corrective action and so on. And in that regard, I think IMF and the United States might help us, to carry on that. And I don't think we believe Chiang Mai initiative as first defensive line. But let me ask, this question: if Korea is really under, severe strain of foreign exchange excess, and then you mentioned that it's not likely for Korea to resort to the currency swap limit. The USA is not willing to do that. And although Korea actually, will try to work out a currency extension of currency swap with Japan, but Japan, the political reasons not refused. So, in that regard, I don't know, what sort of the options, we are given. And then let me go back to Dr. Nolt, your comment. Okay, let me ask this fundamental question. The Trump administration viewed the world, especially relationship vis-a-vis China, it's really zero-sum, confrontational, policy framework. Is there no chance for any positive, collaborations between China and the United States? Okay. And if China and the United States, somehow engage, depending upon some collaborations like the climate change and so on, maybe Korea could be, maybe in a better position to work out our economic problems. But as long as the G2 confront each other, Korea here again, really serious problem. And then also, I want to ask this question. President Trump, during the election campaign, emphasized, the American firms investing overseas actually, they ripped off the job employment opportunity, especially Rust Belt area. But another important thing is that U.S. consumers, they're really looking for a consumer welfare through the opening, trading system. And they can afford the better quality and the affordable price. Therefore, looking at only employment opportunities in the rather selected depressed area, cannot be compensated with the overall, increase in the consumers' welfare gains by resorting to Republicans' traditional trade policy. Okay, so that's the comment I would like to make. And then you also mentioned that Trump is likely to emphasize bilateral economic relationship, right? So on this score, I think let me ask this question. Korea's FTA, Korea-US FTA is regarded the gold standard, and US ITC and many economists in the United States regarded Korea's most successful, benefited a great deal, not only for Korea, even for the United States. In the absence of the Korea's FTA, maybe U.S. trade deficit against South Korea could be much bigger than current the level. So on that score, I think this, I hope the Trump administration appreciate this, gold standard level of the FTA, and maybe this could be applied to other bilateral, So my question is that Trump is going to renegotiate the Korea's FTA, okay, given the, U.S. trade deficit. Okay? And so I want to, hear about your views on this, and maybe
stop there.
That's allowed.
Time is short, and
you
can go for second round.
Yeah, final point, okay?
Yeah.
And I think it could be a really critical mistake if Trump pursues disengagement with, Asia, increasingly affluent Asia, departing drastically from Obama's pivot to Asia policy. Okay, and you mentioned that the growing the supply chain and the interconnectedness in this rapidly rising Asia. So I think U.S. should engage with the even multilateral background, not bilateral basis. Okay, let me stop here. Let me go.
I'm supposed to serve as a discussion too, therefore let me ask one question to Ben. You said that, okay, IMF suggests us to maintain current account.
They didn't suggest, this was a research paper. They simply identified empirically the conditions that went with success in weathering this period of uncertainty.
Then when you talk about Washington consensus, is a consensus among IMF, State Department, Treasury Department, and Congress, whatever, then now you are implying that there is a crack, a rupture in Washington consensus, because IMF diagnosis and congressional, actions tend to show in the divergent path. That is my question to you. And second, to Jim, would James Mattis, McMaster, or those military guys agree with Trump's decision to take military action, given the 1990, the Gulf War, first Gulf War, Colin Powell was one of the key figures who opposed any kind of, engagement of ground forces in Iraq. If military tend to oppose it, then what would be the, Washington dynamics with regard to the Trump's would-be, military action in North Korea? And second, no matter how it is so-called, booster stage interception or not, South Korea, particularly if you have a new liberal president, would be strongly opposed any kind of military action by the United States. And China will also strongly support the South Korean position. Would Trump have a gut to ignore those opposition from American ally from South Korea, American ally South Korea, and even China? Therefore, there are the factors, strong opposition, particularly South Korean population, will be strongly critical of that kind of things, because we are under the enormous collateral damage, possibility from North Korea. North Korea has deployed more than 1,000 long-range artillery pieces. If they can hit anywhere in Seoul, Gyeonggi metropolitan area,
and not just with high explosives, but potentially with nerve gas.
Even including nerve gases. Therefore, we should, the collateral damage to South Korea will be enormous. Okay. Therefore, Trump would take into account the potential damages on South Korea or not. Okay, with those two,
Can I
yes, invest
have one
the
very
funding.
quick
Yeah.
question, because I'm afraid I may not be able to stay.
Well, why don't
longer.
you do it this way? Why don't you throw in all your questions? Let them answer whatever they want. Answer. Okay,
Well,
my-
okay.
my-
I don't know if we
funding.
get too many, we're gonna
No, no, you can select.
Yeah,
That will be
yeah.
much
My
easier.
brief question is,
Yeah,
this is around regional economic integration and, the walking away from TPP that the US did on virtually day one of the new administration. Can you see any way within this 4-year framework that the administration could rationalise for itself, given that it has big corporates at its shoulder saying, we actually need regional trade rules that suit us, not just bilateral? Can you see any way that the administration could rationalise circling back round again to some form of regional economic integration framework? Or is that simply a lost cause for the next 4 years?
I will take one more question and let the third panelist answer. Ambassador Shin, he was our ambassador to China.
oh, great.
Thank you. You mentioned that the United States is efficiently able to destroy most of the nostril markets at the boosting stage for
Yeah.
the seabed ABM.
Mhm.
At the same time, and you said that the United States may not need the that system to destroy all those markets because you have already the sea-based ABM systems.
Mm.
So if that's the case, and I don't quite understand why the U.S. government is so eager to deploy that system. Why the U.S. is saying that this is designed not to target neither China nor the Russia. So do you think the U.S. government is not honest or have a hidden agenda vis-a-vis
Good
Russia,
questions.
China?
Okay, now, Ben, you can start, and then Jimmy, you will follow, okay?
Okay. With regard to Professor On's point, first about the current account surplus, broadly I'm sympathetic to your argument that it can be explained largely by depressed international economy. But I have to emphasize the definition of currency manipulation was the existing one, which the Trump administration hasn't changed yet, was set by the U.S. Treasury under the Obama administration, and I've been a fierce critic of it. I mean, two of the criteria, they lay down quantitative criteria, are related to the current account surplus. And you can have a current account surplus for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with manipulating currency. So I've long been a critic of it. Now, I have to emphasize from my discussions with the Obama Treasury that they were always uncomfortable with this framework, and they went out of their way to never to brand any country a currency manipulator because they knew they were going into a deep political woods that they didn't want to go into. But this was their way of deflecting congressional pressure. So most of this pressure is coming from Congress.
Yeah.
Congress was getting increasingly angry at the administration for constantly letting China off the hook. So
Yeah.
Congress said, we now demand that you set quantitative criteria. And if countries violate those criteria, then consequences must follow. So I'm in agreement with you, but these criteria were not laid down by economists on the basis of economic principles. They were laid down by a political body on the basis of political pressure.
Okay.
The second point you made was that South Korea was a large direct investor in the United States. Well, of course, this is national income accounting. If you're running a current account surplus with us, this means that you have to be sending us capital inflows. And do I agree with you that those capital inflows are beneficial? Of course. I would go further than that and say that the United States, the U.S. current account deficit is first and foremost driven by the insufficiency of our savings. That is, we invest more than we save. So by definition, we need to import capital. If you are exporting capital to us, by definition, you have to be running a current account surplus with us. So this is part of national income accounting, and I agree with you that that direct investment is of benefit to the United States. It also means that we can fund our budget deficit very cheaply because you buy our U.S. Treasury securities at risable rates. Of course, the United States benefits significantly from that. You did refer to the interventions of the Bank of Korea, so-called smoothing operations. Here, I don't agree with you entirely for this reason, that the Bank of Korea changes the rates at which they decide to intervene periodically. And some of those rates that they choose can be subject to the charge that they are chosen in order to manipulate the currency, that is, to produce a current account surplus. We can have a long and probably unresolvable debate about the exact level in the exchange rate at which you would have to say, aha, that's currency manipulation and not smoothing. It would be a very esoteric one. But the only point I would emphasize is that the U.S. Treasury will never accept the argument that any time the Bank of Korea intervenes, it's for smoothing. It will argue that it depends on the level at which they're intervening. Fourth, with regard to Chiang Mai, I would still emphasize that as long as Chiang Mai maintains the rule that in order to call on more than 30% of your quota, you need to be on an IMF program, that nobody will ever touch this money, and therefore it's ineffective. With regard to the BRICS Bank initiative, I would go further. Russian President Putin praised the BRICS Bank CRA initiative, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement initiative, by saying it would lessen the dependence of the international financial system on the US dollar. In fact, it does precisely the opposite. If you look at the last page of my handouts, compare the BRICS Bank to the World Bank. The World Bank, if you look at the World Bank subscribed capital, only 10% of it is in US dollars. 90% of it is in other currencies. What percentage of the BRICS Bank subscribed capital is in US dollars? 100%. This means that $50 billion. This means that the creation of the BRICS Bank actually added a new source of demand into the global economy for US dollar denominated assets. It actually increased the dependence of the international financial architecture on the US dollar. It didn't push in the other direction. With regard to currency swaps, I should emphasize that with regard to emerging markets, the Federal Reserve is taking literally almost zero risk. The reason is that when the Fed does a currency swap with, say, the ECB, we just accept euros as collateral. But when the Fed does it with an emerging market, not only does it take the currency as collateral, but it retains the right to seize your assets held at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York in the case of default. So they have so much collateral that this is as close to a risk-free loan as you can get. So why is the Fed so sensitive to it? The reason is simple: Congress. I've given Senate testimony on this, and I get grilled by Congress about how much risk the Federal Reserve is exposing the U.S. taxpayer to by extending these currency swaps. And the Fed is very, very sensitive to this sort of congressional scrutiny. With regard to your point, Professor Moon, about the so-called Washington Consensus, is there a fissure? No, I would argue no, because with regard to this IMF study that I highlighted, this was a staff research study. It was not a policy recommendation. That is, you did not have the executive board of the IMF recommending that countries behave like South Korea. Far from it. They never would have gone there. This was just the staff economist doing an innocent study of what factors seem to prevent crisis, and this is what they came up with. They didn't go near the policy conclusions. Finally, with regard to Ambassador Fernley, is that how you pronounce it? Point about TPP. With regard to Trump, I don't see any route to reviving it in any form, specifically because of Trump's character. He's a deal maker. And he's right in this regard, and Jim pointed this out, that the United States, taking a very narrow view of what a trade deal is likely to get a better deal on a bilateral basis than it is on a multilateral basis, because of the fact that economically we overwhelm any individual partner that we may want to deal with. From a global perspective, I think this is a completely self-destructive approach. I think one can make an argument that no country in the world has benefited more from a rules-based multilateral trading system than the United States. I would argue, having written several books on the institutions set up after World War II, that the WTO dispute settlement mechanism has been the single greatest success in the multilateral political and economic architecture that we built up after the war, and I think it's a tragedy that we're destroying it. But from his perspective, he will get better deals as a deal maker doing them bilaterally, and I don't see anything changing that. I would argue that had Hillary Clinton been elected, that TPP would have been revived.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because she never really changed her view that TPP was the gold
It
standard.
became politically inexpedient.
No, it
that's
became,
yeah.
yes. And remember, she saw TPP much as President Obama did. President Obama campaigned in 2008 as a trade skeptic. Remember, he was going to renegotiate NAFTA. By the time he left office, he had not only signed TPP, of course he couldn't get it through Congress, but he had completed that, but he was negotiating a deal with the Europeans as well. And Hillary Clinton also saw it as a geostrategic priority. So I had done a blog post before the election arguing that what would she use as political cover to revive TPP? Currency manipulation. Why? She's a very clever woman, and I think she understands that currency manipulation cannot be defined. And if she could negotiate some side deal with Japan in particular, which would, in theory, ban currency manipulation, she could then go back to the US Congress and the American people and say, I fixed the fundamental flaw in TPP. That is that Japan manipulates its currency, and of course if Korea were to join, Korea would have to sign this pledge never ever to manipulate its currency, and now, thanks to me, we can sign TPP. So I do think that in the next administration, which I hope will come sooner rather than later, we will be able to use some sort of political fig leaf like this to claim that we've improved TPP and go forward with it. But it may be too late. I hope it's not.
Jim?
Okay, great. We have a lot of questions here. Some of them I'll answer more briefly than others because there's so many good questions here. One is regarding cooperation with China. I mean, China is the bête noire of almost everything that Donald Trump has been campaigning on. And so I don't see him seeking cooperation except on his own terms. But his terms are far, far away from being terms that China would see attractive or necessary in any negotiating process. So I don't see him making much progress in the bilateral relationship. I see him, I see the relationship deteriorating but I don't see that he's going to be able to get anything close to what he wants, which is balancing trade. I mean, that's a goal that's completely out of reach. And if he tries to go in that direction, he'll either quickly fail and be demonstrably failing, or he'll cause the relationship to deteriorate severely, and and perhaps materially in the sense of declining trade. So no, I don't. And in areas like environment, I mean, he's already gutting the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. He said he's against the multilateral treaties on environment. So I don't see that there's much chance that he's going to help the air quality problem in Seoul either with support from multilateral negotiations, unfortunately. And this is an area I have deep concern about, and it's one of the reasons why I was so opposed to Trump myself. In terms of the trade benefits, I mean, one of the interesting puzzles I've considered and written about a little bit is that if you look at Trump's constituency, people often emphasize sort of, Rust Belt manufacturing workers, and that's definitely one constituency he tried to get support from. But he also got very strong support from the rural sectors, which is mostly the farm-based economy. Of course, the farm-based economy is very trade dependent. And not only individual farmers, not every individual farmer is an exporter, of course they usually deal with middlemen, but agricultural prices are very much
They were
affected.
big supporters of TPP.
Right, they're very much supported by the ability to export. If you get into a trade war with China or with Mexico, and exports decline, obviously so will farm prices. So even the farmers who aren't directly trading are going to, suffer because their farmer incomes are very sensitive to farm prices. So there's a contradiction in the Trump coalition between objectively free trade interests and manufacturing interests that might benefit from a very, hard-knuckled kind of effort to force American companies to redistribute, which I think would be very difficult to do, and maybe only possible in the context of a war or a real militarization of the economy. It's hard, and except for that circumstance, to imagine that he'd have enough power to be able to make any significant progress toward the goals that he set for bringing manufacturing back to the United States. So I think there are fundamental contradictions in the political basis of his whole trading policy, and so that's why you have to raise the possibility that it is just empty promises. But if it is empty promises, then he's going to have to own up to that too, and he'll have a lot of failures to explain to the electorate in the next two elections, 2018 and 2020. Now, the bilateralism issue, I think we've talked about that already. Trump has a very strong bias in favor of bilateralism. I mean, in principle, he's against multilateralism, and I think it also gets back to what you said. I mean, one of the great things about this multilateral system is it is rules-based, and that's it. To my way of thinking, that's its strength. That it tries, it was part of the self-conscious design that you don't want Nazi-style economic policy where you have, the power of the state used to force trade in directions that are useful for essentially the military policies of the Third Reich, which is what Germany did. Use all kinds of bilateral counter-trade and so forth to engineer nationalist trade policies. But Trump likes that, which was, and it's really an anathema to the whole design. He doesn't like the lawyerly kind of, one-size-fits-all rule-based system. After all, he's gotten most of his wealth from bending or breaking every rule he can find. That's what he knows how to do, and he's good at it. Right? So he doesn't want to construct a world system in which rules or laws or norms or anything are the guiding principle. He's just, at his core, not sympathetic with that way of doing business. So if Trump himself is so contained and boxed in and failing that other people with, more reasonable sympathies take charge, people like Tillerson perhaps, then maybe, the worst wouldn't happen. But I think his own inclinations are definitely in the direction of bilateralism, including the idea that every deal is a unique deal. Everything is deal-based rather than rule or law-based. I don't see the problem of Trump of being disengagement from Asia. Some people have said that, and I would say the same thing vis-a-vis NATO. I don't see him as wanting to disengage the United States from Europe or from Asia. But what he wants to do is engage on a bilateral nationalistic basis rather than through multilateral institutions like the EU or like NATO or so forth. What he wants is American power to be always in every deal one-on-one direct to get the best, what he thinks is the best individual deal for the U.S. And I completely agree with what Ben said about this. But I think the fly in the ointment there, as you all can guess, is that it's very, very time-consuming and difficult to do all these individual bilateral negotiations about everything, to problematize every relationship. And where does he have the staff to do that? He's planning massive cuts in the State Department. He hasn't filled most of the middle-level positions anyway, and he's got Steve Bannon over there bragging about the deconstruction of the administrative state. You can't do both things. Again, it's another major contradiction. You can't dismantle the state and then expect to have the staff do all these hundreds of bilateral negotiations on everything. So that's another train wreck in motion. You can't. It's hard to imagine how pushing in that direction can lead to anything but ultimately failure. Right? Now, I think I just endorsed your comments on a potential TPP. I don't have any disagreement with that, so I'll skip that one. Whether H.R. McMaster is probably the best appointment that Trump made. I read his book on Vietnam. It's a very intelligent analysis. It's a very critical analysis, both of the military and the political leadership, and critical of the idea of putting domestic politics ahead of, military security, which is exactly what I'm worrying Trump might do. So I expect, in any foreign policy discussions, I would expect McMaster and probably Mattis to be the most mature voices in the room for some kind of, reasonable policy. However, that would have more impact in something like Iran, where also Mattis, for example, is a Mideast expert. He's been head of the Mideast Command, and where the situation is very complicated, and you've got Shia and Sunni and so forth. You've got a lot of different cross-cutting conflicts. You've got Islamic fundamentalism, and then U.S. oil allies. You've got so many cross-cutting interests. It's a complex situation that I'm sure Mattis appreciates and Trump doesn't. So I'd expect him to educate Trump in that direction. But if you look at something like Korea, it's probably likely that the military leadership would not have much different perspective from what I laid out, because they look at the military realities. And actually, I'm not saying this with any relish, but if there were a new Korean War, this is the type of war the American military is most ready to fight. They hate occupations. They hate nation building. They hate, having to be the civil authority in places, because they're not very good at that, and it tends to demoralize and divide the troops. But if their task is to take out missiles, or to take out a navy, or to take out an air force, to knock out a conventional military, they're very comfortable with their ability to do that. So I wouldn't expect, in the event of a crisis with North Korea, that they would be the ones saying, no, let's negotiate. I think they would be confidently telling them, we have these military capabilities. If you say, this is what we should do, yes, sir, we'll do it, and we'll get the job done. Now, why THAAD? The U.S. has a nuclear triad: bombers, sea-based, land-based ICBM, for one major reason: redundancy. They like redundancy. They like redundant systems because in a nuclear conflict, you don't want to have any mistakes. So if one system doesn't work, or it's somehow neutralized, you want to have another system. So American nuclear planning is very much based on redundancy. So even if that is in some sense a redundant system, it would still be seen as, in a situation where you've got nuclear armed missiles, as a prudent step. But there's another way in which it's important, because that is always there. And when I say a sea-based system, they have to be moved into place. The U.S. doesn't permanently have destroyers stationed off the coast of Korea. If the U.S. were to be subjected, if South Korea were to be subjected to a surprise attack, then that might be the only system in place at that time, right? The missile scenario I'm talking about is where the U.S. has a deliberate aim of intercepting launches, in which case they would deliberately move the ships into place. It would require a specific naval deployment to do that, right? They're not permanently stationed in those places where they could easily intercept missiles. So that would be, if you're proactive rather than reactive, then a sea-based system is going to be very useful. Same thing, by the way, with Taiwan. I've been in the Taiwanese Ministry of Defense. They're dreaming of THAAD too. And that's China's big nightmare, by the way. That's one of the reasons why they oppose THAAD here, is they don't want to see Taiwan get it. But, the U.S. could also put cruisers in the Taiwan Strait and could, accomplish much more than a THAAD system would there. But they have to be there, and they're not always there. Right? So it's not as reliable a deterrent. And finally, would Trump care that, China and South Korea might be opposed to actions? We'll see. That's the virtue from the standpoint of political provocation or military provocation of a sea-based action is that it's entirely under the United States' control. I mean, the U.S. Navy, and of course, we'll all remember our history, that the provocation that led to the Tonkin Gulf, which at the time, they said, well, the U.S. ships were in international. Of course, now we know they weren't international waters. They were, in North Vietnamese waters, and that they were operating coincidentally with the U.S.-sponsored covert raids into North Vietnam and so forth. The public didn't know that, but the fact that you have naval forces under your own command, not subject to anybody else's or any allies, interference makes a sea-based action really quite politically unconstrained compared to, say, coordinating some action with the South Korean military. They could do this unilaterally, very easily. And whether Trump would take into account South Korean views, if he thought it was good for him, I don't think he necessarily would. He knows, on the one hand, he knows that he can say, well, yes, we're behind South Korea, but on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily mean that he has to listen to everything the South Koreans say, because he, again, as a kind of nationalist leader, can say, well, if it's in American interests, let's say an ICM threatens the United States, we don't care what South Korea thinks. I'm thinking of this Trump, because what we care about is our national security. We're going to intercept the missiles. You don't like it? That's tough, because we have to take care of our national security. I mean, to me, that's the kind of mentality that he has, and I don't think that...
Scary.
Yeah, it is scary.
We have 5 minutes more to go. Any comment from some journalists?
I had a question,
James made quite
Jennifer Chang from
Okay,
President.
Jennifer.
Hi,
Finish.
it's Iran's TV network. What would constitute something serious enough for Trump to override South Korea's wishes and actually, invade North Korea or do what you're talking about, jeopardize like millions of South Korean lives? I mean, what would constitute his idea of a threat of an ICBM hitting the U.S. mainland? Is it an ICBM test? Because North Korea reportedly had 2 ICBMs on launch pads. Just a couple of months ago they were sighted. And Kim Jong-un had threatened in his New Year address that he's going to test those.
Well, first of all, let me make clear, what I'm speculating is not what I think is reasonable. It's what I think Trump might justify in his own way of thinking. I'm trying to put myself in his shoes, and I can't, of course, claim to know for sure what his thinking is. But I have read biographies, I have some idea of who his advisors are, what his mentality is. This is not something I can rule out. It's not something I'm sure would happen, but it's not something I could rule out. That's the way I would put it. I'm not saying Trump will do X, okay? But what would be sufficient justification? If you, for example, read McMaster's book on both Johnson and his advisors' view of Vietnam, they had very little concern for what would happen in Vietnam itself. They were starting a war in Vietnam Johnson was very clear about it because it was to his domestic political advantage. He gave not a hoot about anything else. And, McNamara and McGeorge Bundy and several other advisors said very clearly, if the United States' credibility suffers, that's more important than anything else. So, and McNamara made this statement in January 1965, before the U.S. troops were sent. He said, it's better that we send, troops there and fight for a long time and fail than just not fight at all. That was almost a consensus within Johnson's advisors. Don't worry about if we're going to fail, but American credibility will suffer if we don't try. If we are not seen to try. So when you're thinking from that, and that was Johnson, who was relatively more, and his advisors much more restrained in many ways than Trump is in their worldview. And yet, their calculation was basically what's good for America and what's good for Johnson's domestic political life. if that's true of the Johnson administration, I don't think you could expect more from Trump.
Trump tweeted it's not going to happen.
Right.
When
and-
Kim Jong-un said in his New Year address,
Yeah.
we're going to test an ICBM, show that we can, bring it back down, onto the U.S. mainland without it breaking up on re-entry.
I think it would be.
Trump said it's not going to happen.
It's not going to be,
He tweeted
and I
that.
think it's relatively easy for him to rationalize. And the rationalization may not convince you, it may not convince me, but it would convince a lot of people to say, well, look, this missile was launched, we don't know what its target is, we shut it down. And by the way, that wouldn't be, I'm not saying he would unilaterally invade the North, he doesn't have that capability. But if he starts routinely shooting down missile launches, what would be North Korea's reaction? I can imagine something like they send submarines out to drive those American ships away from their shores. Well, then who shoots first? It's like the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Here's we detect a North Korean submarine, or it's like Tonkin Gulf, torpedo. Are they shooting at us or not? Well, maybe, maybe not. Who shoots first? Who knows? It's in the middle of the sea. You got militaries there. There's no reporters there, right? So the idea of an incident at sea seems very likely. And
So
then
miscalculated.
you sink a North Korean submarine. Then what? Then what did they do next?
So a miscalculated war.
It's not
would
even
start.
necessarily a miscalculation in the sense that he may not worry about escalation.
If he doesn't care about the lives of Koreans.
Yeah, I mean,
Very simple.
don't count on that calculation being important to him. I'm sorry. I mean, it is important to me. I'm not saying that he should think this way, but realistically, don't count on him being humanitarian. Okay? I'm sorry.
A quick question about, when you talk about possible currency manipulations, allegations of currency manipulation, you're saying it's hard to tell. Some of the conditions that countries like South Korea have could be defined as currency manipulation. What are the remedies that a Trump administration may try to impose that would benefit the U.S. and not benefit South Korea?
Well, it's clear. I mean, the Obama administration was moving in the same direction. They just put many intervening steps before the last one, which would be to impose some sort of countervailing tariffs. But before you get there, under the current Treasury guidelines inherited from the previous administration, you have a long series of negotiations with the alleged manipulator to resolve it. I would expect Trump to keep some version of that. I would simply expect that he would reach the tariff stage sooner.
Yeah.
He's proven he's not completely irrational about how to use it, in that he violated his campaign pledge to declare China a currency manipulator on day one, because that would have been literally insane. China is intervening in the currency market. There is no doubt about that. But to our benefit, at least according to his definition, China is intervening to keep its currency up right now, not to push it down. So he's proven he's not certifiably insane about that. He's not charging them. But who is the most likely target of a manipulation charge? Obviously South Korea. I mean, Japan is not intervening regularly in the foreign exchange market, so that's a far harder target. We clearly know that South Korea does do that. Then you get into your argument about what the purpose of this intervention is. And of course, we cannot resolve that in the abstract. The U.S. Treasury will have one view. The Korean government will have another view. At the end of the day, the Trump administration will make its own unilateral judgment, and then South Korea will try to use multilateral institutions to try to countervail. Who knows how this will play out? I hope we don't get there. But we're moving in that direction.
Is it similar to what the U.S. and Japan faced during the Reagan years, where Reagan was able to use that to leverage more?
I think Reagan is the exact template that the economic nationalists within the Trump administration want to use. Now, mind you, WTO restrictions on the sort of actions we could take in the 1980s were much less than they are now. So this is what particularly worries me about the Trump administration. At the point when they start openly flouting WTO rules, and we saw leaked documents recently that
Right.
suggested that they are moving in that direction. Then my feeling is that the whole international trading system, the multilateral trading system, collapses. Because once the United States, which is really the foundation of the system, says we will no longer respect the rules, no one has an incentive to respect the rules. And we could go back to the 1930s quicker than I think most people realize. So very scary stuff.
Well, I'd like to add one thing to that too. In the currency manipulator charge, I would not expect that it would be used in terms of a rational calculation. I think it's going to be used politically. So whether South Korea or some other country is designated so, it'll probably be in the context of a bilateral negotiation where he'll use that as one of the bargaining chips. You know, he'll say basically, well, if you do X, Y, and Z, we'll certify that your central bank policy, and the X, Y, and Z might include some, you know, targets, you know, related to monetary policy, trade policy, and so on. But I expect he'll just be adding that into the mix of the levers that he can manipulate to get the bilateral deal that he wants.
Trump is looking for scapegoat, and South Korea would be most ideal scapegoat for the Trump administration. Therefore, we got to watch out. With this, let me conclude this session. Let's give people power. It's very scary. Yes.
사진 안 찍나? 넣었나?
Let us take a photograph.
Oh, sure.